It is no wonder that our government leaders and many commentators, market observers, especially economists that follow Keynesian, some of the Keynesian economic ideas, said we need to do something and we need to do it now, and a lot of it. And the government came through with a spattering of stimulus actions. So we'll take a look at each of the actions now, starting with what the Federal Reserve did on the next page. What I've tried to do in each of these lists from each of these entities is capture as many of them as I could at a broad level. In many cases, there were sub-programs that were part of these, and I'm sure I missed a number as well. But the information is out there. It just takes some effort to compile it. So the actions of the Federal Reserve and Treasury in the fourth quarter of 2008, it started with basically allowing Lehman Brothers to fail, and then forcing broker-dealers to become FDIC-insured institutions, and then it went on from there. And it very much reminds me of the story of the little Dutch boy and the fingers in the dike, except the leaks just kind of kept coming from all over the place. And that's partly why we end up with such a spattering and such an uncoordinated, or apparently uncoordinated, response to what was going on. Is things accelerated very quickly. And then by early 2009, the Fed and the Treasury got to where they were more coordinated, put plans in place, and we're seeing some of the fruition of that today. So collectively, these things represent historic action by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has never done anything like this in the past. And in many cases, emergency provisions were invoked in order to give them the authority to do some of these things. A number of them have already expired. The purchase of long-dated treasuries they completed at the end of October. Emergency provisions allowing FDIC-insured banks to lend to their investment arms. That expired at the end of October as well. Backstop the purchase by Merrill Lynch. I just read, actually late this afternoon, that agreement was terminated as well. There was a fairly reasonable sized fee that Bank of America paid for that, but they decided that they didn't need it. And I neglected to put on here that the Fed dropped interest rates ultimately to zero, or a range, what they describe as a range from 0 to 1/4%. It's very hard to estimate the value of the decline in interest rates. But once they got to zero, they had to start to resort to some other things. A good way to understand what the Fed has done is to take a look at this through its balance sheet, which is on the next page. This was taken from a speech that Chairman Bernanke gave, so I lifted it right from that talk. And what he has done is he's highlighted the changes, the deltas from basically the extreme onset of the crisis, which would have been the summer of 2007 to the end of September, quarter end September. And you can see the balance sheet exploded from a little under $900 billion to $2.1 trillion. And along the way, it went through a number of changes. He's got these divided into some major categories that then have some specifics underneath them. But briefly, let me make a couple of additional comments on what's going on in here. In terms of the short-term lending programs for financial institutions, those were there to provide a liquidity backstop when they needed emergency funds. As a rule, it was for banks, broker-dealers, money market funds that only needed something for a short period of time on their estimation. You can see that there's still $264 billion outstanding there. It actually was as high, it might have been higher, but on the December 31st, 2008 financial statement for the Fed, it showed almost $1.2 trillion, almost $1.2 trillion that was there in short-term lending. So a lot of that has unwound. Targeted lending programs, these were loans primarily to non-financial borrowers. The commercial paper markets in particular seized up very significantly in the fall of 2008. And so these were to corporations that did a lot of their active borrowing in the commercial paper markets. This likewise was higher. It's now, or it was at $84 billion at the end of September. It was as high in December of 2008 at $334 billion. So those have come way down. So some of that emergency short-term action that the Fed had to take to make sure companies weren't going to go belly up literally overnight, really staved that off significantly, and we've unwound the bulk of that. A big part of the more recent action that the Fed is taking has to do with an increase in the securities that they hold, in particular the government-sponsored enterprises of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae. And these, again, went from 0 to $824 billion. It was only $20 billion at the end of 2008. So this is an accelerating program, and there's more to be invested there. I'm going to shift now down to the liability side of things. What funds the Fed is primarily reserve balances, and you've got Federal Reserve notes, the currency that is out in flotation. And you can see there's been some increase in the currency, but that's mainly driven by our demand for it in order to basically conduct commerce. But the reserve balances are basically banks that have excess funds that they don't want to lend, and so they put them back on deposit with the Federal Reserve. And you can see that's gone up to about $900 billion. And that is a key part of what's financing the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet, in particular the government-sponsored enterprises. Currency reserves combined with currency and reserves combined are what is called the monetary base. And on the next page, you'll see a picture of that. This is a chart that goes back to 1975, and this is a weekly chart, so it ended October 23rd of last month. And what's interesting to notice, of course, is this tremendous spike that took place over the course of the last year and a half or so. In terms of reserves, you can see that they've basically been flat going all the way back to 1987. Here, there was a little bit of an increase in the early 90s associated with the savings and loan crisis and the banking crisis that we went through there. Here's the spike for September 11th. But this is basically we've never seen this before. And then what you do is you add these two together, and they come up with monetary base. And this is the picture that everybody has been worried about with respect to inflation. All else equal, if the Fed is pumping a lot of money into the system, over time you should see an increase in inflation. Everything else isn't equal all the time, and what's happened is rather than the money that's being pumped in the system into the banks being lent out to all of us as consumers or to the corporate world, instead, they've turned right around and put the money back into the Fed, and so it's just kind of been recycled is all. And that's been a key factor as to why inflation hasn't really gotten underway. The concern, however, is that when banks start to lend again, which could be a while, but when they start to lend again, the Fed's going to have to reverse course and figure out the so-called exit strategy that you'll hear some noise about today. How is the Fed going to extricate itself from this situation so that we don't see a huge run-up in inflation? Let's look at the Treasury picture now on the next page. Both the Treasury and the Fed's actions have really unfolded in fits and starts over the course of the last couple of years. They've worked on a coordinated basis and on an uncoordinated basis, and I think largely it was who had the authority to do what, and if you had the authority, you got stuck doing it. And they work and they feed off of each other as well. Now, the bulk of the Treasury action comes under TARP, which I imagine is in most of our vocabulary these days. TARP was enacted in September of 2008. That's what most of the programs fall under TARP, but not all of them do. The TARP program, Troubled Asset Relief Program, was basically an authorization by Congress for the Treasury to invest or